Thank you, everyone, for joining the webinar today. Today, we're going to be talking about supply chain visibility. So I'm very excited to have with me one of our resident supply chain experts who has been specializing in dashboards. So he's going to talk about some of the top forecasting accuracy dashboards, KPIs to track. So Justin, you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back. For those that are returning, this is my fourth time doing a webinar, so I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're excited to have you here as well. So my name is Helen Oti. I'm going to be moderating this webinar. And before I get started, I just want to say that if at any point in time you have trouble hearing us, please let us know using the chat feature in GoToWebinar, and we'll try to assist you. We'll also reserve a few minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, so feel free to enter your questions if you think of them using the GoToWebinar questions window. And at the end of the survey, take a few minutes to help us know how we're doing. So I just want to give a quick overview of Arqiva. I know there are a few people on the call that do not know Arqiva, so I know some of our clients are on as well who might be quite familiar with the company. But we are focused on helping businesses with better planning. And the reason for that is because we believe improved business performance starts with better planning. What does that really mean? So what that means for us is that we embrace the fact that your supply chain is unique. We see that as a competitive advantage in the marketplace. So our solutions are created in a way that you don't necessarily have to fit a mold. We provide value-driven solutions that are really personalized and tailored to your specific supply chain and specific supply chain challenges. So along those lines, we have a full suite of solutions to help you with this. We see that as the backbone of what we do, but ultimately is driven by your unique process, your unique business. So one of the things that we're going to be sharing today is our dashboarding feature, which is a standard feature that everyone that buys any of the modules that you can see here gets. We're going to be focusing a little bit more on our demand planning feature. And this is really a core part of the Arqiva solution. If you look at this graphic here, it talks about some of our modules that we have. We have a full suite solution all the way from integrated financial planning, something to help you with response planning, and then which essentially helps you have a better inventory management process, and which in turn helps with demand and supply balance. And so that's all visualized using the tool, and Justin's going to be sharing a little bit more about that. So again, as we talked about, even though we are a solution provider, we focus more on helping you optimize your processes. So in order to be able to do that in the demand world, we believe that you have to be able to proactively respond to demand, and real-time collaboration, getting cross-functional synergy between the different teams is essential. And all of that really ties into you being able to discover actionable insights, and having dashboards and KPIs are all part of that equation. So this is a screenshot of one of our standard demand KPI dashboards that you could have with Arqiva. And the cool thing about this, I would say, is that it's powered by our in-memory database. So it means that it's really fast, it's real time, has the visibility that you need, and it's updated as you need it as well. So it really helps you with getting full visibility into what's happening as you go along. And I think Justin's going to be covering a little bit more on that. What should this dashboard have? What are some of the KPIs that should be included on the dashboard? So let's take a brief look at today's agenda, and then I'm going to turn it over to Justin to do some introduction on the topic. So we're going to look at an overview of dashboard KPIs, and the way we wanted to approach this is, instead of just giving you, let's say, here are 10 KPIs, here are 5 KPIs, just a checklist of KPIs to track, we wanted to take a more holistic approach to this. So we're going to look at forecasting as a whole, how do you track your forecast errors, What are some of the reasons why you should be tracking this at all? Is this even important? And then we're going to do some analysis on some of the different forecasting KPIs. So I guess the first question that I will push over to you, Justin, is just give us that overview picture on, why we should be doing this, how does this even affect our forecasting process?
Well, thank you, Helen, for the introduction. So forecasting is obviously it's a very important part of the demand planning process, but it's one tool in an array of things that you can use throughout your entire planning process. And so that, to me, is why I really want to look at the whole holistic approach. And what I want to discuss is its role within the greater umbrella of all the demand planning processes that you're looking to do. And so really there's 5 elements that I want to address as we go through our webinar today. And I'm going to start up at the top of this graphic here, measuring at the point of decision. This is going to be a key thing that we're going to address and come back to as we go through the things today. And so that can be as simple as, knowing where you need to select your analysis based off of what the necessary lag is. Where are your inputs coming from so that you are making your decisions at the right point in time, and you're analyzing based off of where you can respond to areas of improvement. In previous webinars, I've talked about the necessity of what makes a KPI, and part of that is being able to address a point of action where something can come about. It's different than a report, right? You're evaluating decisions that you have made in the past and looking for areas where you can improve. So the second part of that then is measuring the results of your action. Starting from maybe a point of naivete and working your way all the way through the decision points and the areas of input whether it's automation or whether it's through human effort, but where each of those decision points comes from till you get to your final action, and then taking a step back and looking at where were the improvements, where were areas where maybe things even turned for the worse, and being able to deep dive into that to get more information. The next aspect of that then is, well, what were the external factors that played into this? Ones that you know about, or maybe in retrospect, identifying things that were unknowns at the time, and just sort of, identifying what your opportunity cost is in all of this. For the KPIs we're going to be looking at, a lot of that is going to be, focusing on things like promotions and marketing, and just ways of avoiding, having to do these clearances to clear out inventory where mistakes might have been made. The next aspect then is the burden of choice, right? So you've got these KPIs, you're monitoring things, but have you taken the low-hanging fruit where you need to? Are you working your way higher up the tree where, maybe there's another tree right next to you where there's new low-hanging fruit? It's always going to be changing, right? And being able to take a moment to reflect on areas where automation can come into play, areas where automation might be failing, where more human involvement might be necessary. This is sort of our fourth element in this holistic look at your KPIs. And then finally, circling back to the bigger picture. How does your demand forecast accuracy play into everything else? And obviously looking towards, maximizing profit and those sorts of things. There's going to be other elements to that, whether that's, increasing your on-time in full metrics, reducing waste, these other aspects that tie into it, and just seeing how all this kind of works together. So to that end, I've got some open-ended questions to start off with here. And one of them, is, do you know which products and situations where forecast accuracy for your business is the key driver of business results? Conversely, do you know when you can rely more heavily on forecasting, and maybe when, on the contrary, you might need to set up your operations to have higher tolerances for forecast errors? Looking holistically at forecasting and its entire, role in the planning process is as important as the forecast accuracy KPIs themselves. So why track forecasts? Well, if you aren't tracking your forecast, then you really aren't setting yourself up for improvement. And so I wonder, on what basis would you know whether accuracy that you have right now is good enough? To that end, what is good enough? A lot of people are asking us that question, and really there's no defined answer, because it all circles back to the entire process and where that low-hanging fruit is in your overall planning strategy. So let's walk through these 5 elements in a little bit more detail here. Let's talk about measuring at the point of decision. And so really the foundation of that is, using the right aggregation level, as well as weighting and lag for each purpose. And so the part of the planning process you're in might dictate, the level of aggregation as well as the time frame. So I've got a couple examples here in this table. Maybe you are a CPG business and you're looking at, items down to the material location to prevent, stock outs. You're doing your analysis on a daily basis, right? And you got this short-term horizon. To contrast that against, say, the production planning aspect, maybe at your factory, where you are looking at the scheduling and doing things on a weekly basis. Maybe your horizon's a little bit longer, and then compare that to if you're looking to source all your raw materials and determine your packaging requirements. And at that point, it's not a day-to-day operation. Obviously, much bigger frequency, longer horizon. Knowing where your point of decision is going to be is a key part of setting yourself up so you're not setting yourself up for failure, right? So that your KPIs are going to be based in relevancy, so that you can be able to respond to that. So again, use the forecast for where the time lag matches, where the critical business decisions are being made. If you have a supplier that's delivering from the Asia Pacific region, it has a lead time of 10 weeks, the quality of the forecast when the order was created is going to be what matters, not the quality of the forecast when the product arrives. So second in our wheel of holistic approach is to measure the result of your actions. We're going to spend a good portion of our time, on this, looking at some of the different metrics that are in use. We've got, forecast bias. We've got the mean absolute percentage error, et cetera. Take a look at some of these. It's important to monitor your forecast metrics continuously to be identifying changes, and really these insights from these different methods, bias and MAPE and MAD and so forth, it's important to use more than one metric. Each one has its advantages and disadvantages, and so you can lose some of the signals if you are only focusing on one metric and not tying all of them together to look at it in a much broader way. For some of your products, it's going to be really easy to attain a very high forecast accuracy, and in other situations there's the question of whether it's cost effective to work on mitigating some of the consequences of forecast errors. And for ones that fall somewhere in between, which might be the majority of your products, there's a continuous need to evaluate the quality of your forecast and how it works together with the rest of your planning process. So how can you break down your results into smaller portions to identify where things are going well and where there's room for improvement? I think the idea is to find areas where the results are more fruitful than other areas and determine what can be extracted from that to use elsewhere, or where your data is going to have a greater amount of uncertainty. So the next aspect of this is, measuring your opportunity cost. We've got 4 different, aspects within this that I want to look at. And, if you only focus on forecasting and you don't spend any of your time optimizing other elements that are impacting business results, eventually, your forecasting is going to get good, right? You're going to get better. If you're focusing all your effort on it, you're going to improve. But the return, the marginal return, is going to decrease. You're only going to get, minor improvements if you're not focusing on other aspects within your business process. As an example, a moderate increase in safety stock for, let's say, a long life cycle, long shelf life product could be better than having demand planners spend a lot of their time fine-tuning forecasting models, or doing manual changes to demand forecast. Here's an alternative. If the remaining forecast error is basically just random variation, right, further attempts to increase that accuracy is going to be fruitless. There gets to a point where, what's left outside your model is just going to be, things that are unknowable at the time the decision points are being made. And so, how much effort does it take to get to that point versus, where could you better spend that time elsewhere? I think this is a KPI that can yield a lot of fruit because, each planner is there for, this many hours a week. I won't necessarily say 40 because I know a lot of us work a lot of hours, but, that time is very valuable. And so at what point are you reaching those diminishing returns and you could be better off, spending your time, elsewhere, right? What is your opportunity cost? If you're looking at inventory reduction, you can evaluate a large batch size, alternating the number of delivery days, et cetera. There's a lot of different, other things that are in play when you are, trying to see if really you're at a place where things are good enough. Do your forecasts accurately capture the impact of events that you know beforehand? Things like promotions and price changes and those sorts of things. But I guess the key takeaway is an excellent forecast won't produce excellent business results if the other parts of the planning process are also not equally good. The next aspect, measuring the burden of choice. This is the idea of exception-based process for monitoring accuracy. You want to make sure you avoid being swamped or risk losing demand signals in the averages. This is, primarily a measure of what you need to achieve, such as efficiency or profitability. Where are areas where automation can come into play? Previously you were looking at the number of hours that demand planners, are spending doing their thing. And, if you're starting to get stuff that's working well, if your accuracy is at a point where things are going good, where can you start to, apply rules in place of doing these sorts of things? Can you quantify, these sorts of things and create rule-based stuff to free these, your experts, where a lot of your expertise lies, so they can keep finding those new low-hanging fruits, right? And so to measure that in our software, we've got ways of looking at, where the success is, not just in things like, what's your MAPE, how's your accuracy score, but, if you're using demand analysis, right, and you're doing this 9-cell breakdown of, where things are high variability, where's your fast-moving stuff, and to isolate and say, okay, well, we do this analysis and we say for this segment of your portfolio of business, of products, we want to apply this type of statistical forecast because that method, works well. Is, the next month when the new data comes out, and that demand analysis is reanalyzing your particular combinations, how many of these items are flipping from, one type of determination to another? What is being classified as seasonal this month and next month, the different numbers will crunch and say, oh, well, now it's more of a linear thing and less of a seasonal. And so a new stat forecasting method is going to be applied. And so, there's these things to be mindful of, that when you are automating things, these edge cases can flip from one thing to another, and that can be your margin of error, when you're trying to analyze your forecast accuracy. And so, it goes both ways. Where is your automation working well, and where is your automation, causing, margins on the error where you could fix things up. Ultimately, this is one of the key parts of looking holistically at your forecasting KPIs. Quick point of caution here, there are places where you might find yourself having to choose between what would be the most accurate metric, the one that scores with the least amount of error when you're revising it, versus what something's intended use ought to be. And so there's that conscious decision there. I know this thing, should be classified seasonal, even if it's currently, not reflecting that. And so those points of human intervention there, for needing to understand that, when forecasts are more likely to be poor, it can make it possible to perform risk analysis of the consequences of either under forecasting or over forecasting, and being able to make those business decisions accordingly. Occasionally, you've got situations where an extreme forecast error, can be really detrimental to the planning process if it's been set up to only tolerate, a certain level of uncertainty. If you've got high margin items, in that situation, stockouts are usually worse than resorting to some sort of clearance sale to get rid of excesses. So in that situation, a rosy parameter input is often, the better way to go. For a low margin item, it just makes sense to have more cautious inventory plan in place. Real quick, I want to discuss just 4 unavoidable truths in forecasting, because we'll talk about these when we're looking at our KPIs. 4 rules here. The first one: higher sales equals greater accuracy. This is an important truth that the regions of your companies that are your best performing product lines, etc., they're always going to be easier to forecast. An example of that, let's just look at a small example. Let's say a convenience store that's located, near in a touristy, destination. You're planning to move, 100 Cokes, every day, and so you're stocking, according to that. But then the tour guide, says, hey, this little convenience store, they've got one of the best honey mustard, Coca-Cola, whatever, things that you've ever had. Give it a try. And so this slow-moving item, that has these low sales. If all of a sudden everyone that gets off the bus, comes in your store and grabs one of those, you're going to move a month's worth of stuff in one day. And so those slower moving items with smaller sales, blips and those sorts of deviations are going to cause larger ramifications than, say, moving your number one seller, right? In the same way, aggregation, and this can go both ways. This can be through SKUs, whether you're lumping multiple products, product families, product lines together, or on a time horizon, right? Going from, weekly analysis all the way up to, yearly. It's going to dampen that random variation that we were just talking about. The law of big numbers starts to come in play here. So aggregation is going to increase your accuracy, but of course, it's going to decrease usefulness. And so the crux then, becomes how can you, find ways to deep dive into your KPIs to sort of isolate, where are you finding success in your process, and is it duplicatable, so that aggregation doesn't be, as necessary. You can try to stay at that lower level and then apply those points of success on accuracy to other areas. Short term is more accurate than the long term. It's harder to plan further out. That's just the way it is. And lastly, forecasting is obviously going to be easier when you're in a stable environment. If there's a mature product and you're trying to forecast that compared to a new product launch, obviously the mature product is going to win. I think at the CPG level, things like groceries are probably easier to forecast than, say, fashion, things that can change overnight. Mature products, things that are established, are going to be easier. And so questions come up: how do you measure, against long-term goals? I kind of alluded to this previously. If you're only focused on forecast and you're not spending any time optimizing the other elements in your business results, whether that's safety stock, lead times, batch sizes, or planning cycles, you're going to reach this point where you're only going to make marginal incremental improvements. Since forecast accuracy is a tool towards maximizing profitability, and so you're looking towards these long-term goals, the key really is determining where those areas of improvements lay. Is the forecast accuracy the weakness in your arsenal right now, or have you reached this level of maturity where you can focus on segments within it and either increase that automation or pivot to changing your stocking policy for a given product? Just being able to see the bigger picture in all this and where that fits into everything. The benefits that come about from all this, obviously, the more accurate your forecast is going to be, you're going to be able to reduce that safety stock, minimize waste, better margins, fewer clearance sales, greater advantages when trying to secure your packaging and all the materials and all that, and then operate with lower capacity, time, inventory buffers. These are all great things that would everybody would be happier if we had all these things working for. So with that said, let's start looking at some of those specific metrics that we were talking about earlier when I talked about bias and the mean absolute deviation, et cetera. So let's look at a few of these. So first, we've got our forecast bias, and quite simply, bias is the difference between your forecast and your sales. This is an accuracy measure. So when you're looking at bias, your target is from a bias percent is going to be 100%, right? And as composed to some of these other measures, which are error measures. So this one's an accuracy measure. So if you see a positive deviation, that's just going to be a trend of just overestimating, and conversely, negative values are going to indicate underestimating. And so one of the advantages of the bias is it shows you that over versus under, that the other metrics, they're just showing error. How much are you off by? But this one, in which case are you generally going? And so this sort of tool more useful, say, when dealing with a subset of users that generally, are very optimistic. You got your marketing and sales folks who are always, the sun's always shining, right? Everything's always happy. And so you can say, oh, we'll sell 1 million, and then it turns out you sold half of that. So here's some sample data here. We've got our three materials, X, Y, and Z, and you can see in the first column what the actual sales were, what the forecast would have been, and then that deviation there, that bias, showing positives where the forecast was optimistic, overly optimistic, and was too high, and then for material Z where it was below, and then you can just do the simple math there to do the conversion into the bias percent. In aggregate, the group of materials as a whole might be accurate, and so when you roll stuff up on a simple bias calculation, overestimating on one and underestimating on the other can kind of net to zero. You know what I mean? And so you can see relatively accurate bias at an aggregate level, even if you're not getting it maybe down at the individual material level. And so understanding that crucial part can be important, in determining where you're doing your analysis. Is this down at the store level, where you are not wanting to run out, have the shelves empty out on a particular product, or is this more, strategic planning on, at a high level is whether or not that rolling up is going to play a critical role in your choice of this particular, metric. Next one up on our list is the mean average deviation, the MAD. And so unlike the last one, this is an error measure. So in this case, 0 is best. And basically, this is an indication of how large an error is that you have in your forecast. One important thing that I like to point out with the MAD is it is being reported in units, and so comparisons across items isn't that useful. But it does have a very strong strength, and that's looking back in history for a particular item and being able to compare different models. Let's look at a sample on this. So keeping the same items here, materials X, Y, and Z. Material Z's larger forecast and sales are masked a little bit when solely looking at the MAD. So they all have, relatively speaking, a pretty similar MAD, right? From 29 on material Y all the way up to 47 on material X. Averaging them together on that roll up, you get an average calculation of 38. But what's missing in this is that material Z was a tremendous mover in terms of volume, and so that relatively low MAD score doesn't play into that. Whereas material Y missed its threshold by quite a bit in terms of looking at that as an individual level. So you lose a little bit of that. But conversely, let's show where we use MAD a lot in our Kiva. We're looking at our statistical forecasting module, and what we see is a mixed bar graph here for a particular item. And we're looking at the history shown in the blue columns, and time is on the x-axis here. We've got several different lines plotted on this graph, and each one's displaying a different statistical forecast methodology. And so MAD is a really good tool in this situation because it can identify which model or which forecasting method had the least amount of error relative to the actual history. You can see the ebb and flow of each of these lines, and then the one that's bolded here is the one that had the least amount of error using the MAD calculation. Since we're comparing apples to apples, this is comparing this one product across its own history. MAD is a very appropriate measure to identify which performed best. So this is a great method for selecting which forecasting method to use. So in the early part of your holistic approach, right, starting from the naive all the way up to your final plan that you use to go forward, MAD can be useful as steps along the way of finding out where are you picking the right one, and where's your error and that sort of stuff. Contrast that with another type of error measure. We've got our MAPE, mean absolute percentage error. So this is forecast minus sales over sales, and in this case the error is presented in relation to sales volume. And so generally this is much more commonly used for comparisons because of that relation. So going back to our same example again, we've got our XYZ here, and the MAPE scores, now you can see that much smaller value for material Z there, that 5% compared to material Y and X. And so for most people, when you're thinking about, well, how accurate were you, we naturally, as humans, we tend to cluster things together. We like to group things. We like to see things, in comparison of size. And so this is the way our brains tend to naturally think. And so this is an easier one to digest. When you roll it up in aggregate for an average, things can get distorted there, right? That 81% is going to get equal weighting of that 5%, right? And so 37 plus 81 plus 5 divided by 3, you get 41%. And so, in that sense, you can say, well, that can be a little distorting. So then you can come back one more time and say, well, you can do a weighted MAPE. All right, well, let's look at that and measure it against its proportion of the whole. And so the weighted MAPE is going to give you these final results that take each underlying element's proportion into account. So in the previous example, that material Y, that large error but small total impact is going to be reduced. So as a result, you're going to get a much better score. I'll put that in air parentheses here. But what you're going to lose is the sight of underperforming slow movers. If your goal is to come back and find where are your slow movers or things that are not doing what you thought they want to do, this weighted MAPE is going to cause that to disappear. And so I would, if you're looking at it exclusively, these sorts of situations where these little guys that don't make up, they're part of the long tail of your total portfolio, and they might be underperforming here and there. Each one on its own might, constitute a small amount of your total profit margin or loss, but if you're never stepping back to look for them, they can accumulate into a substantial portion where if you're focusing your efforts on just the big movers, in total, this can catch up, on you if you're not ready for that. So what I want to do with the KPIs that I want to show you is to kind of paint a picture. And the way I was thinking about this, if I wanted to sell my house, I would, the real estate agents always advise you, take down pictures of yourself, paint the house neutral tones so that someone can walk in and they can just envision themselves living in that house. And we've got a lot of different people on the call representing a lot of different businesses. And if you've listened to my previous webinars on KPI development, I'm a big advocate that copying someone else is not a good way to go because each business has its own unique constraints and its own unique situations. And so what I want to do is present some somewhat abstract KPIs. And the goal then is, having been talking about this holistic approach to not just know the point that you need to measure and how much effort are you putting into that measurement and where can you automate things and all that sort of stuff, is where are there gaps in your KPIs, right? Where Have we touched on anything today that is going to, say, oh yeah, we haven't been looking at that, and that really could be a driver in making improvements. And so I want to walk you through some of these, and I'm hoping maybe we might trigger some areas where if you project yourself into this and think and start to think yourself, where are areas that you're overlooking? Can you drill into your analysis deeper? Maybe fine-tune things that are already working pretty well. So let's take a look. So for point number one, measuring at the point of decision, we talked about having that right forecast accuracy at the right lag. Here's a look at the bias that's trying to isolate, your portfolio by the point of decision. Bias covering this idea that we are consistently favoring or dismissing reality instead of our perceived best guesses. And so there's this attempt to classify each segment of the portfolio where the individual point of decision may rest. Maybe you guys have in your business, a product line that has a larger lag time than the others because its ingredients, are sourced from farther across the globe. Maybe you have vendors, with stipulations that necessitate some sort of bigger gap between when you order and when you receive those inputs. And I want to say it's okay to analyze different segments within your business in different ways if the points of decision vary across them. So here you can see product families A and E have a much shorter lag than C and D, 1 month versus 2 months, and then the product family B, for whatever reason, needs 3 months. And so you can design your KPI to accept this sort of difference and measure accordingly. It doesn't have to be one size fits all. When looking back, if in reality the point of decision is different across your portfolio, then analyze each one, where its point of decision is. Next one, measure the results of your actions. And so a critical KPI in all this is measuring the outcome of all the labor input. So beginning with a naive forecast, which we have up at the top here. What happened yesterday is going to be what happens today. How is each step along that forecasting process improving the results? So the first iteration is the statistical forecast. You can measure the forecast error over time, but in a single time period, you can measure that forecast against doing nothing, right? And you can compare that improvement against the input from the sales reps or the demand planners. And so that is the next line below statistical, right? That change from what came out of the engine to what the planners say, and then that in turn can be compared against another layer of inputs, or however many you have, whether it's constraints from manufacturing or any other steps in your business that you have between where you start from to where you wind up with that final plan. So in this instance, because it really is like an apples to apples comparison, MAD is the viable evaluation criteria. In this instance, we see an error reduction from just shy of 2 million from the naive to about 1.75 million for the statistical. And then if we go down a little bit more, we got about 1.7 after input from the demand planners. And lastly, getting under 1.6 when moving to the final forecast. And so 20% reduction in error overall. And so thinking about, this is relatively abstract, but putting it into your own, context, isolating, what the improvement level is for each of these steps along the way, and seeing, where is that low-hanging fruit? Where are the areas where, you are spending too much time for too little results, where you could reroute, resources to try to, improve that overall accuracy. And then we can start to, deep dive into that a little bit. We can start to, we were talking about the 4 inevitable truths about forecasting. One of them was the time horizon, right? The immediacy is going to be more accurate than things that are far away. Are you evaluating where your planners and your customer sales reps are spending their time? And here's one way to try to measure that sort of opportunity cost. So given what we talked about earlier, we know the fewer months out, the more accurate it's going to be. And so we're breaking down all of the, changes to the forecast by, when they took place, and then partitioning that by what type of role that person is, whether they're a sales rep or whether they're a demand manager. And so to make this a proper KPI, you want to have some sort of target to measure against, and that could vary considerably on a business-to-business scenario. Another one here, another type of deep dive, percent of override by Pareto analysis. And so here's an example of trying to analyze if the effort is being utilized in the right situation based on what we know about forecasting accuracy. So breaking down the business by volume and variability, one can predict that greater results can be achieved by focusing on the weaknesses of the previous steps. So forecasting is going to have more trouble on higher variability, and the consequences are going to be more significant where volume is higher. So you would expect that people should be focusing their efforts on higher and left turn cells in this 9-cell analysis, and less so on the bottom and right side cells. And so stepping back and looking at where actions are being taken place. This can be an indication of possible retraining, right? If you're seeing huge spikes in things that are C-level volume and low-level variability, the exception being obviously if like a sales rep knows something in particular, then obviously putting an override in there is going to be important because they got off the phone with somebody, they know something, right? But in general, if you see in aggregate these sort of things trending the wrong way, maybe people are they're losing sight of the forest for the trees, right? They're focusing on what's in front of them and maybe need a little bit more redirection on where their expertise can be most useful because their time is limited. And so doing some sort of analysis like this can show you, very quickly, where is everyone spending their time and is it in the right place? You could go a step further on this. You could start to break down by an individual, and see where's their value add in that 9-cell analysis. And if there are trends you start to see over time, what is that person doing, or what do they have at their exposure that can be replicated elsewhere? Where's the success stories coming from, so that you can hope to drive those same sort of results somewhere else. So just a multitude of ways that you can really get into those opportunity costs. In a similar way, you've got the automation side where in the Archiva software, by rule, you can start to flag things for people's attention, and you can start to look at, well, what percent of flagged items are getting reviewed, or what percent of items are getting flagged, and where's the forecast value add in relationship to those? Are we painting such a broad stroke that we're not really focusing on the ones where we could truly do it, or how can you slice and dice different scenarios of are you do you have the right number of rules in place to properly flag the right percent, or can those be changed? Again, looking at the burden of choice here. I kind of mentioned this before, but what proportion of your business is being set up in a way that automation can be improved, or automation needs to be dialed back. To be able to look back and say, you're trusting a lot of rules in place so that the planners can focus where they need to be, and so some simple KPIs can help you keep track of whether you are keeping your automation processes in place. Lastly, tying everything back to the bigger picture, you get things like financial KPI integration, and these sort of bigger pictures of profitability and modifying your safety stock and these sorts of things. And so a litany of opportunity here in just integrating that what's coming out of your forecast accuracy as a feeder into these other metrics that are going to be strategically implemented from your CEO or something on down, and how that all sort of ties together. So in summary, we've got really just a variety of tools that are they're at your disposal, where you can try to look back and see, am I spending too much time on my forecast accuracy, or is it good enough? Do I need to take segments within that forecast accuracy and maybe introduce a new metric to see, are you letting the slow movers, or things that are underperforming that, well, they're low volume, I'll let it go, but there's a lot of them, and so in aggregate it starts to chip away at those higher level KPIs like profitability. And are you integrating these together to just tell the entire story? So again, if you want to know about KPI development, I really would recommend listening to some of our other webinars that really talk about the need to individualize and understand that where you are is different from where everyone else is, and how to best approach its development. But maybe some of these ideas we've talked about today have kind of pierced let you see an opening of where you have a weakness in your coverage of your KPIs, and where maybe you can find some new ones that will help you ensure you're putting your resources where they best ought to be.
Thanks, Justin. I really enjoyed that last graphic that you had there, showing that big picture, all the KPIs. I think a lot of the times we tend to approach the KPI discussion looking at that holistic view and really get into metric mode, right? So I like the fact that you were able to break things down a little bit. Some of the key takeaways that I also noted. So just basically examine your opportunity costs, make sure that you're striking a good balance between tracking an accurate forecast and improving your process. The goal here is to create value throughout your process, and that's essentially what the whole concept of trying to create better visibility across your supply chain is. Now, as Justin mentioned, we've had other webinars on this topic. We have some planned webinars coming up as well. You can find that on our website if you go to arkiva.com/webinars. And just like we have some questions here that are very specific, if you want to see a demo, have us go at your data basically and take a deeper dive into what's going on specifically with you. If you want to see our dashboarding tool, feel free to go to our website and just click at the top to request a demo. So at this point in time, if you have some questions, I believe we have some that have already come through, and we are going to take a look at them now. So one question that we have here, Justin, is how do you measure the different forecast scenarios for the same month? So for instance, if you have April forecast, but with January, February, March scenarios, I understand comparing versus decision point, but do you also compute and compare the following forecast?
Well, I guess part of that is whether you're looking at evaluating your procedures in place, or if you're looking more for improving the accuracy for the month at hand. So if you've got this April forecast with your 3 different scenarios from prior months in place, you've got your decision point, right, where you kind of lock things in, and then you saw the changes as things go on. And the question then, how do you measure the different forecast scenarios for that same month?
Yeah, so I think the main thing here is, because we're looking at the different scenarios and we don't have the specific data on the different months, it becomes very difficult to just talk about it just at a high level, right? So again, I think these are some of the questions that would be really great when we go into the deeper dive offline. We can certainly look at this, take a closer look. We also have another question here. I think we may have some time for a quick question. So we may have some time for a quick question. I know we talked about this a little bit, but Justin, what would you say? Are there maybe, I know we showed it a little bit on the dashboard, a standard list of KPIs that you should start with if you're not using a solution like Arkiva at all. Just maybe off the top of your head, some things that I know we talked about, MAPE and MAD and some of the error measures, but are there some certain things that people should be looking out as well?
Yeah, I mean, your forecast accuracy is going to be your starting point, right? And start tracking that, over time, to see, if you are making strides, right? Because that becomes your control variable as you are fiddling around with day-to-day activities, right? And coming back to your S&OP process and seeing, okay, accuracy has, improved, and starting to isolate, what were the causes of that. We looked at, what are those external factors, right? Sales and marketing stuff being properly integrated, or are you, doing this on a whim? And so without a robust statistical forecasting, engine in place, there's certainly going to be a lot of variability. So using that as a starting point, and then beginning to monitor where your efforts are being placed, so that you can start to find that low-hanging fruit and get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you mentioned the statistical forecasting engine, because one of the questions that we have here is if this is something that you can quickly do in Excel, right? It certainly makes the job a lot easier, and the chances of you having errors are greatly reduced. So I think this is all that we have time for today. If we were unable to answer your question, we'll follow up individually and answer your question offline. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us, and we hope we can connect with you one more time next time. Cheers.